Our week 8 topic is reconstructing environment. Really, when we're talking about the environment, I should more properly probably call this the reconstructing ecological adaptation. So it's not just about understanding what the environment was like that people lived in the past, but also how resources available in the environment, how we can identify those in archaeology. And the reason why we want to identify those is that they allow us to then make some interpretations relating to human behavior, right? Which is ultimately the goal of archaeology. So when we think about the environment, then we have to think about it not just in terms of its physical components, but also the plant and animal environments that also exist as well. And the primary means through which we understand this is not just geoarchaeology, as we'll talk about in terms of physical environments and reconstructing physical environments, but is also through other ecology-based approaches, biology-based approaches, and zoo archaeology, of course, is another major thing, and that's our week 9 topic as well. So let's start with geoarchaeology then, which is the study of archaeological questions or undertaking archaeological interpretations or investigations using methods developed from the physical or earth sciences. And so one of the ways that we can reconstruct the physical environment is through sedimentology. So we have a number of ways that we can study sediments, again, borrowed from geology, that allows us to understand what was the formation processes that contributed to not just forming those sediments, but then also depositing them in archaeological sites. And so here's some examples of some different kinds of sediment as identified by their mechanism of transportation. We can also study the landforms themselves and the processes that shape those as well. And so this is really critical because the landscape that we look at when we're conducting an archaeological investigation may not represent the landscape of the past, of the people who created that archaeological site. So we have to consider both sea and end transforms in terms of how they are then shaping the landscape and how the landscape has changed over time to what we see it today. And so I always encourage students when they're at a site to close their eyes and take a minute based on the data that we do know what the landscape might have looked like in the past. There's some specific environments that are particularly useful for archaeologists, and there's other specific processes that we also have to consider that are significant for, again, shaping archaeological sites, but also where people lived. And glaciation is definitely one of those, that through glaciation we have water being locked up. The weight of those continental ice sheets cause the land masses or the continents themselves to become depressed, and this then impacted the coastline. Basically, the sea level was low. Yes, there was some depression, but basically what we're seeing is that parts of the coastline that are now currently underwater because of deglaciation and the rise of sea level, and then that isostatic uplift where the continents are uplifting again, means that archaeological sites along the coastline essentially may be found underneath water currently. So we have to think about that what might be mainland or inland today may not have been in the past, and vice versa. What might have been on a shoreline today, or what is on a shoreline today, may have been inland in the past. So we have to think about the differences in what we see today versus those different larger processes that have shaped the landscape over time. Another environment that we tend to be very interested in as archaeologists is cave sites, and this is because they serve as natural conservatories. This is because a lot of processes that impact open air sites don't come into play into caves. And so there's been a lot of studies that have been done on caves and on the mechanisms through which sediments enter them to look at cave formation and cave deposit formation. So this is another particular environment that there's been a lot of study focusing particularly on those formation processes. Okay. So once we shift from the physical environment, then we can start to think about the paleoecology, or what is the plant and animal environment like. And the key for reconstructing these kinds of past environments is to focus on what we call proxies. So these are the remains of past animals and plants. And so they can either be microfossils or microbotanicals or microfaunal, or we can have macrofossils or macrobotanicals or faunal remains that we will also investigate. What makes paleoecology a little bit different is that we are, of course, concerned with human activity and human and plant and animal relationships, but we have to remember that humans don't necessarily exploit all of the resources or potential resources that are available in their environment. So reconstructing the environment is only one step. Then we have to consider what we're finding in those archaeological contexts that tell us about how plants and animals are actually being used by people. So I've provided you with a bit of information about how tree rings are really critical. They tell us a lot of information about the climate, and of course, because we can use them in dating as well, tree material is really important when we can recover it in archaeological sites, but of course, because it's an organic material, it doesn't always preserve very well. Other botanical remains that are really critical is pollen. One of the reasons why archaeologists are very fascinated with pollen is because of its abundance, because it preserves well in most environments, but also because pollen itself is very diagnostic to the plants from which it's found. So I've given you some example of pollen as observed through a microscope here, and we have different types of pollen, and you can see that they have different kinds of shape. And this one that kind of looks like Mickey Mouse in profile, or not in profile, sorry, face on, or from behind, this is from the genus Pinus. So this is pine tree pollen. So if you ever see pollen like this, you know it's from pine trees. So it's really visually distinctive. Here's an example of how we can use looking at frequencies of different kinds of pollen sampled throughout a stratigraphic sequence in an archaeological site in order to look at how the plant environment has changed over time. And so you see that initially we have a natural forest cover, then we see humans come into the area, we see a process of clearing that we can see on the basis of frequencies in key species changing over time, so either decreasing or increasing. Then we have a farming period, again, where we see further decline in things like oak. There's a period of regeneration where we start to see a bit of a rise in some of the trees and a decline in some of the grasses and shrubs, leading to a full forest cover environment. And then we see another period of clearance itself. And in the notes below, I provide a little bit more explanation for the context of this particular site and again, how we get to these interpretations. Aside from wood, we can have other forms of macrobotanicals. We can study things like seeds and fruit. Of course, we have plant residues, and I've already mentioned remains of wood as well. How do we recover these materials? Well, through the process of flotation. So we take our sediments from our archaeological site and we put them in a flotation tank by running water through the tank. What happens is the water comes up over the rim of the tank, goes through a number of different sieves. The sieves have different sizes, which means they capture different kind of size materials. Of course, heavy materials go towards the bottom, like rocks and stuff like that, but botanical materials will float, and so they'll then go down and be captured through these various seeds. Some of the finer particles in sediment will end up in a settling tank. Sometimes there can be subsequent other settling tanks with even increased finer mesh at each of the different entry and exit points. And this allows us to basically recover these organic materials separated out from the sediment, and then we can process them for analysis. We're going to spend time in week 9 doing zooarchaeology, but I did want to introduce a little bit about the study of faunal remains. So of course we have micro and macrofauna. Both tell us different kinds of environment or information about environment. And microfauna in particular has been focused on by archaeologists because of what it does indeed tell us about climate and environmental change. So we know that birds and actually a lot of reptiles and amphibians are really great indicators of climate. Birds can tell us about seasonality or seasonal variation because as you may be familiar with, we have migratory birds, for example, here in North America. And so the presence of a bird in an archaeological site tells us something about potentially the season in which that site was being occupied. Other animals, other microfauna are very sensitive to temperature changes. So if we see the sudden disappearance of a particular type of animal in a region, that might tell us something about climate change in the area. Of course, snails and other mollusks can be really useful for us because their shells themselves are calcium carbonate, which we have a number of dating techniques we can use. Calcium carbonate is also useful for isotopic analysis, which can also tell us about season and seasonal change as well. Of course, insects tell us about climate and environment. So they can be really useful tools for us to reconstruct climate and environment. But as I mentioned here at the bottom, we have to be aware of taphonomy, or those site formation processes, because some of these things can accumulate naturally at sites, right? So you can imagine that burrowing insects or microfauna such as rodents might be found in archaeological sites simply because they live in the sediment that we're digging into. Large animals, on the other hand, tend to be a really good indicator for us of human diet, that often when we find them in archaeological sites, we find them there because they are being consumed and processed, not just for dietary, but for other subsistence practices, right? For clothing and shelter, for their residues, and also in some cases for their secondary byproducts, right? So not just their hides, but their fats that can be rendered and processed out of them, their sinew and their tendons that can be used as string or for binding or sewing. Of course, we can have things like hair that can be used as wool. So all of these different things are really critical for human survival. But of course, fluctuations in their populations over time have been affected by many factors, including human activity. So I've mentioned this term a couple of times. This notion of seasonality, basically the idea that certain plants and animals, their availability can vary across seasons. An example I always use to show how this is impacted not just by human behavioral, but by natural cycles is, I remember when I was growing up that mandarin oranges were called Christmas oranges because they were predominantly available to us here in North America around the Christmas time. Now we can get them year round because of globalization and trade networks, etc. But in the past, we tended to find people moving to acquire resources that they need. And so we can look at the movement of people or the presence of plants and animals outside of their territories as either an indication of movement of people or of seasonal change. So I've provided you with an example in the notes here of how we can use microfauna to reconstruct seasonality. So this is an example of mollusk shells from a site in Japan. And what they were able to do was look at the incremental growth lines present in the shells to figure out how many seasons these shells had been growing for before they were harvested by people. And so that gives us an idea of when the peak seasons were for harvesting of these important resources. And so the graph in the lower corner here shows you that the majority of harvesting was occurring during summer. There was a little bit of spring, summer, but through fall and winter, basically, these shells were allowed, or the organisms that lived within the shells that produced these shells were allowed to live, repopulate, etc. We can also look at botanical or floral remains and look at seasonality as well. So this is an example that I believe came out of Egypt, looking at how different root foods or tubers and rhizomes are found at different parts of the year versus seeds and fruits. And so we can see that there's quite an abundance of various root foods following the annual inundation of the Nile, which basically floods the plains are adjacent to the Nile, creating these beautiful nutrient-rich fertile fields. When the waters recede, then we can have these tubers harvested. So they're harvested beginning in late October, then November, December. Then we see a decline leading back into the flood season, of course, when nothing's being harvested, but there's planting at that time. And you can see that initially as the tubers start to taper off, we see nutlets starting to be, so club rush nutlets starting to be exploited, but then they decline, so they have a short growing season. And as they are in decline, then we start to see palm fruits being harvested instead. And so again, by looking at the various frequencies of these different kinds of materials in an archaeological assemblage, it might tell us about the season in which a site was being occupied. So of course, reconstructing the environment, then if we put all these pieces together, so this is an example of Eland's Bay Cave, where they were looking at changes in sea level, which impacted the ancient shoreline and the modern shoreline. So we're looking at the little cave site here, and the modern shoreline is the solid line. The ancient shoreline is the dotted line. We can see how it's impacted where water was being found, where the estuary of the river was located. And when we look at this and compare this with the faunal data from the site, we can see that there are actually periods of hiatus that happened, likely as a result of the coastline shifting during this time period. We think that it's not just because people were abandoning the area, but also because as the area then was recovered, different kinds of plant materials were available that were suitable forage for different kinds of animals as well. So we see lots of diversity before the hiatus occurs, and then we see a decline in that diversity because as animals are coming back into the area, only certain kinds of animals are coming in response to the particular kinds of plants that are also recovering in the area as well. Of course, we as humans impact the environment on both local and global scales, so we have to consider this. We'll talk more about domestication when we talk about zoo archaeology, but I have talked about a little bit in this presentation as well, and so we'll come back to that. About this is one of the most radical ways that we've impacted plant and animal resources. Of course, agriculture is actually very destructive for the physical environment. It has serious consequences in terms of plant and animal populations as well. And many archaeologists in certain parts of the world have argued that this is one of the major reasons of the collapse of particular societies or groups. So here's an example of one of the ways in which humans impact the environment. So this is what the environment looked like. Also on the bottom side, this is basically a cross section through a valley and the various sediments that are present. And then what we see is how this valley has been impacted over a period of 300 years through agricultural practice, that essentially terrace slopes were created to facilitate olive groves and olive trees being planted. And so this is impact other soils that are present in the area, and of course the shape and the profile of the valley itself. So of course, the reason why we care about the environment is because this is where humans get the resources that we need to survive, and we call this subsistence. So a lot of the techniques that we use for environmental reconstruction, we also use for subsistence reconstruction or dietary studies. And I mentioned here that it's one of the most advanced fields of study in archaeology. There's a lot of techniques and technologies that we use, a lot of methods for this. And it's simply because of the vast amount of data that's available to us that we have lots of faunal and floral material that's allowed us to do some really intensive studies to do this. And then I've just provided you with some basic terminology here to clarify some key points that we talk about diets because really what we're getting at are long-term eating habits of a group of people, and that's what we're really interested in. However, often in the archaeological record, we might find evidence of meals themselves. So do meals really represent a diet, or are they just a small snapshot of that, right? So just because you had pizza for lunch today doesn't necessarily mean that it's a critical part of your overall diet, right? It might be a special feast that you were participating in, right? We'd expect to see turkey, for example, if we were to go through the garbage of our communities at certain points of the year because of how turkeys are associated with particular holiday feasts, right? They're not really an everyday food, but other foods are, right? So these are the kinds of things that we have to think about when we're reconstructing subsistence practices and diet in the past. I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't kind of mention a little bit around this when we start to talk about diet, that there's a lot of pseudoscientific literature out there that is supposedly based on our studies, on archaeological studies of how we have reconstructed diet in the past. And Marlene Zuck has written this wonderful book called Paleofantasy, where she critiques a lot of these pseudoscientific studies and suggests that really, again, if we truly look at what the archaeological record is, that it shows that there is no one true singular diet for humans, and that actually what's probably made us such a successful species is the wide range of dietary adaptations that we have around the world. It's our ability to not be specifically adapted to any particular diet, but rather exploit a whole bunch of different kinds of resources that has led to our success. And those of you who've taken classes like 209 or biological anthropology may have heard about how one of the reasons why we think the robust Australopithecines was kind of an evolutionary dead end, was that they were too dietary specialized, that they had these massive teeth that were adapted to eating tubers and other hard foods, whereas the gracile Australopiths had a bit more of an omnivorous diet, which was more selective and advantageous, particularly as climate change kicked in, because we've had several periods of radical climate change over the Earth's history, over hominin history, that have shaped our evolution as well. So this is just meant to be a brief introduction to major subsistence strategies. Some of you might have been exposed this into earlier anthropology courses, so I just want to clarify some of the terminology that we use when we talk about subsistence. So let's go back to this idea of diet. So again, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of evidence that we can use, and I'm going to go through each of these in turn. So in terms of plants, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that there's a whole bunch of behaviors related to processing, harvesting, etc., plant materials before they end up in our diet, and then how we find those plant remains preserved is often separated from those behaviors that led to us consuming them. And this line kind of represents where we eat them as well. So we have to be aware that where we find plant remains, where those remains are preserved, are not necessarily where they may have been processed or prepared, or where other critical human activities were occurring. So we have to be aware of, again, all of the C transforms that are part of contributing to how materials end up in the archaeological record. We also have to think about how different parts of sites, depending on what kinds of sites we're dealing with, may create a form of bias in terms of different kinds of plant remains that are found, right? And we talked about this a little bit in garbology, that we may make assumptions around the class of people based on the foods they are consuming, right? So dietary difference may tell us about class structure or political structure, that different kinds of people, different groups of people are able to access different kinds of food materials and plant materials in particular. And what this picture is meant to inspire you to think about, again, is this idea of how out in the fields where plant remains are being, or where plants, are being produced as part of agricultural practices, plant remains are going to look very different here than they are in a residential area versus in a ritual area versus a marketplace, right? So we have to be aware of this, that where we are finding plant remains within a site, and also what kind of site we have, could tell us, create a form of bias. So one of the ways, of course, that we might be interested in, this ties back into that earlier slide in terms of how plants are being used, is to do something called paleoethnobotany, which is where we look at the modern uses of plant remains in order to understand how we're finding remains in archaeological contexts. Of course, we can look for things like plant residues. Phytoliths and pollen are often considered to be this, but of course we can have lipids, DNA, and sometimes organic parts of the plant itself, right? So some of its fibers can be found. Fossil impressions can all be useful for us to figure out how plants were being processed and used. This is one of my favorite studies of all time. I'm a little biased because one of my friends was involved in this, and some of my colleagues that I know. But what's interesting is that the work of Mercator et al., this article here, what they were able to do was recover some starch grains from some stone tools and they were able to demonstrate that these stone tools were not used by humans, but actually were used by chimpanzees. And their argument for this was that the plant residues that were found on the tools were from foods that humans don't eat, but are from nuts and tubers that chimpanzees do eat. So they've argued that based on not just the technological analysis of the stone tools, that they don't look like other stone tools that humans have produced or early human ancestors have produced, but they were basically being used by chimpanzees to process various foods. So I think this is a really neat application that had some neat consequences. Domestication, I've already mentioned, is a radical way that we can understand how plants are being utilized, because we're seeing the selection for particular traits. So the example I've given here is the difference between einkorn or wild wheat and then domestic wheat as well, or a domestic version of einkorn itself, right? And so some of the characteristics that we see in these domesticated plants include something called indehiscence. Sorry, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. This is where seeds remain on the stalk. So they have this tough rachis, which means that all of these little spikelets don't come off the ear without having basically threshing occur. This is important because we want to collect all of these little spikelets, right? This is what we then process into our flour. And if they're all falling off all the time, that makes it a lot more difficult for us. In other cases, we want pods. Think about things like peas. Because we don't want the seeds to be burst. We want to be able to collect them easier. Of course, gigantism, having larger seeds, is a really easier way to process, harvest, handle, and consume these materials. We often start to see manipulation in terms of how they mature because they can be beneficial for harvesting. For those of you in biology, you might have heard about the R versus K selected characteristics, that we want rapidly selected characteristics, so characteristics that we can alter or adapt quite readily, very rapidly, so we see the plant changing in response to our selective breeding. But note that a lot of these traits, while commonly found in domesticated plants, don't pertain to all crops, that crops being used for foraging or feed by animals have different traits than those that are being domesticated for consumption or use by humans. Of course, we can look for other evidence of domestication in societies where we start to see art, such as these ones we can see. And so here's some examples from around the world of people harvesting olives or grains from the field and then sorting them. So they're in this Egyptian motif, they're harvesting them here on the bottom, and then they're threshing and removing again those spikelets from the stalk. Here we have some Mayan servants or courtiers serving hot chocolate or cocoa to an individual here of higher status. And here, in this image from Asia, we have a farmer plowing a field of either millet or rice. Because they're plowing, we don't know exactly what's being planted here. Of course, animals are really critical. One of the first questions we have when we find an animal in a site is, how did they get there? Were they brought here because of a human or because of a natural process, right? Did a gopher just burrow down into a site, or was it something being consumed and used? We have to consider all the different ways that we use animals. Again, not all animal remains are being used for dietary purposes, but also for clothing, shelter, etc. And so this study is zooarchaeology, and we'll talk more about this in week 9. Just as domesticated plants have different characteristics than wild plants, wild animals have different traits than domestic animals as well. So here's a list of several traits. Of course, some of these vary depending on the use of the animals, but things like presence outside of their so-called normal or natural range. Sometimes the population frequencies can tell us differences, that if we see lots of numbers of young animals within our assemblage, that suggests that they're culling the population itself, right? Because those young animals aren't able to breed and reproduce and supplement that population. Different ratios of male to female animals can tell us about animals that are being raised for milking and other secondary byproducts versus meat. Teeth, very common in domesticated animals. And in pigs, for example, we see a gradual decrease in tooth size. So some animals, we don't like them to be big and scary and have big chompers that can hurt us. In other animals, tooth size isn't that much of a concern. Generally, we see a decrease in size, but again, this depends in other factors as well. And of course, if we're using an animal for its secondary products like wool or hair, then we expect to see changes in those features as well, which may or may not be preserved in the archaeological record itself. So here's just a brief list of all the various uses of human uses of animals. Again, we'll talk about this more in zooarchaeology, and you'll have a chance to look at this in the subsistence lab that's coming up after reading week. We find lots of different kinds of evidence for animal use, not just the remains themselves, but we can think about net sinkers used to hold down fishing nets. We can look for remains of the animals themselves, such as mammoth footprints. This is a carving of a horse head showing a possible bridle. So you can see the horse's eye here. Here's its ears, then here's its whole muzzle. So there's its nose, whole its mouth, and you can see that there's these lines here around its neck, up around its ears, and around its mouth that suggests that it was had a bridle in place. This is a reconstruction of a mammoth bone structure. So sometimes we use the bones from the animals to construct basically the framework for shelters. This is an example of a bison skull that has a projectile point embedded in it. So that's a good sign that this was hunted by a human. Right, so we have all this different evidence. Lots of really neat work going on in terms of cat and dog domestication. I provided you a fun link about how it looks like cats have been domesticated at least twice over their history. And some of their domestication processes appear to be these animals in particular, cats and dogs, have proven their utility to humans for keeping away other predators, for killing or eliminating vermin, sources of contamination of our food source, such as rats, right? So we think that cats and dogs actually basically got to stick around humans, and we started to supplement their feeding and started to breed them because they were very useful to us. And then I've provided you with a summary here. So again, we're going to revisit these topics in the subsistence lab in the week 9 topic of zoo archaeology. And yeah, we'll talk to you more then.